Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. For those who may not know me, my name is John Thompson, and I'm Professor Emeritus in the Department of Biology here at Waterloo, and I'm also the Associate Vice President Research. And on behalf of the Office of Research, and on behalf of Ferden Hamdalapper, our president, who is one of the sponsors of these lectures, and also on behalf of Charmaine Dean, our Vice President Research, who also sponsors these lectures, it's my singular pleasure to welcome you to the second research talk of the Fall 2017 series. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to students in the crowd and also to staff. And I do so because it bears noting that these research talks are meant to provide an opportunity for all members of the UW community, students, staff, and faculty, to hear about research that's being conducted at our institution from the practitioners themselves. In other words, to hear about it firsthand. Our speaker today is Roy Brower, who is Professor of Economics and Executive Director of the Water Institute here at Waterloo. And the title of his presentation is Global Assessment of Payments for Watershed Services. Indeed, Professor Brower is principal investigator of this massive project, Global Assessment of Payments for Watershed Services, an investigation that includes examining water quality and supply, biodiversity, and carbon storage provided by our forests, our wetlands, and of course our grasslands. And today he will illustrate how a global assessment of watershed services will help make the payment schemes for water more cost-effective and efficient. Now, we all get water bills. I get them, I grit my teeth every time I get it because it seems to go up every day. But I, like you, pay these bills in blind faith that the money that we're providing is indeed going to service a system that is cost-effective and efficient. And I'm confident that Roy will convince me of that even more strongly today. Roy took up his role as Executive Director of the Water Institute and Professor of Economics at Waterloo about 1.5 years ago. And I know I speak for the entire UW community when I say that we are delighted, absolutely delighted, to have him on board. Prior to that, he was professor at the Free University in Amsterdam, where he served as head of the Department of Environmental Economics. He has also served as a member of the National Water Policy Division of the Dutch Water Ministry, a role in which he advised the Secretary of State about the economic aspects and consequences of national and European water policy. And he has also served as an advisor to the European Chemicals Agency in Helsinki, with a particular focus on the economic impacts of the regulation of hazardous chemicals on European markets. Roy is currently a member of the International Advisory Board of one of the largest interdisciplinary doctorate programs in water resources management in the world, at the Technological University of Vienna in Austria. And he is also editor-in-chief of the Elsevier journal, Water Resources and Economics. His own work on water resource economics has been published in more than 100 peer-reviewed international journal articles. And I think it's fair to say that a common thread among his writings is the huge cost of environmental damage to our natural resources, in particular water. Indeed, he recently co-authored new guidelines on natural resource valuation methods. I can tell you strongly and with great confidence that Roy is a world-renowned pioneer and leader in the rapidly evolving and increasingly important field of water economics. Today, he will tell us about his current research on the design and evaluation of economic incentives and policy instruments to manage scarce natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Roy Brouwer.
Thank you very much, John, for these very nice words. I'm going to talk about the role of economic markets in managing our increasingly scarce resources, and then specifically water. And this is part of ongoing research that I brought with me from Holland, from the Free University. As John said, we're actually not allowed to say Free University anymore because it sounds so cheap, and we all know that it is very expensive to get an education. So it's ongoing work, and it's focusing very specifically on the prices that we pay for our natural resources. A lot of the resources around us provide services free of charge. We don't pay for it, actually. I just heard John say that he gets upset about his water bill. I would argue that the way we currently pay for our resources is not even close to what we actually should be paying. We don't actually pay enough, in my view, for the use of our resources, in particular water. And so that will be what I'm going to focus on in the next 30-40 minutes. I'm going to go to the underlying reasons why payments for watershed services has become an increasingly popular way of managing scarce water resources. Besides straightforward regulation by governments, the creation of markets helps governments to reduce the pressure on their budgets that they have to make available every year, year in, year out, to manage our natural resources, and leaving it up to the market really reduces that pressure. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what payments for watershed services are, and then I did a study, a global assessment of what drives their success. And I'm an economist, but I'm also very interested in the institutional design of the various schemes and arrangements that exist worldwide, and how those arrangements influence the provision of ecosystem services. So my hypothesis is that the design has a very large influence on the economic efficiency, the cost effectiveness of providing those services. So how these schemes are implemented in practice really gives us a lot of insight in how successful these schemes are. And then I'll end with some conclusions and recommendations. The work that I'm presenting is part of shifts in what is more generally called water governance, where straightforward command and control regulation, top-down regulation, is increasingly being replaced by markets. The instruments that I'm particularly interested in, PPPs, public-private partnerships, for example, but also community-based resource management. And you may have heard of Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner. She was particularly interested in investigating under which terms and conditions these networks were effective in self-governing their communities and the resources on which these communities depend. So why do we price water? In some cases we have a law. Economists like myself like to do it because we think it has a very important role in signaling the true value of our unpriced resources. And as you may know, economists have the carrot and the stick. By pricing natural resources, we can induce behavioral change. So in a lot of the environmental problems that we're dealing with nowadays at a global level, human pressure is one of the major causes. And so it's my conviction that you also have to go back to human behavior, human use, and human engagement and interaction with the natural environment to turn that around, to turn back and to go towards a path of sustainable development. The carrot obviously means that you use financial incentives to incentivize people to do good. You use the stick if you think people do bad, and you tax them, for example. You punish them for their bad behavior. Law, very briefly. So I'm from Europe, and for many years I worked on the European Water Framework Directive, which has as an overall objective to reach good ecological and chemical status of all the water bodies in all the 27 European member states. And it's one of the first environmental laws and regulations at European level where economics plays a very explicit role. So it tries to achieve that objective through the application of economic principles like polluter pays principle, economic analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, for example. So you have river basin management plans that detail the best management practices to reach the ecological objectives, and these ecological objectives have to be reached in the least cost way. So that's a cost effectiveness analysis. And economic instruments are very explicitly mentioned as well. The procedure being here that you identify water services, and the moment you identify a water service, you have to make sure that people pay for the service. So that's based on the principle of the beneficiary pays. And that's a very sensitive political discussion, as you will see in the next slide. So in that European Water Framework Directive, in Article 2, the 27 member states managed to get an agreement and consensus about what kind of water services we're talking about specifically. And they're listed here: water abstraction, treatment, distribution, so it's basically drinking water, wastewater collection and treatment, and impoundment and storage in reservoirs. And it may not come as a surprise that member states are happy and ready to identify these very explicitly like this in a law or a regulation, because we're actually paying for them. We're paying a drinking water price. There are charges on wastewater treatment. So cost recovery of the provision of these services is actually to a large extent already taking place. The economic instruments are already there. But the European Commission has actually been taken to court by NGOs like World Wildlife Fund because of the very narrow interpretation of what exactly a water service is. And I list a few more here: irrigation, food processing, transportation, hydropower, recreation, biodiversity, cultural heritage. So water has many more services than just the three that are listed in that particular article in the Water Framework Directive. And the characteristic or the common feature of a lot of those broader water ecosystem services is that they're public goods. We're not actually paying for them. They're publicly provided, and it's very difficult to assign individual property rights to these goods and services, which makes it very difficult also to trade them in markets. So they have no market price, and we don't factor them in our decision makers. If you have a factory and the factory actually has to price for the discharge of wastewater, they will factor that in their decision making. If it is free of charge, they will not care. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to see how we can incentivize factories, companies, industry, etc., to take those public goods into consideration. So this is the narrow and this is the broader interpretation. There's an important signaling function of pricing. It's not always very easy to price these public goods, but they have important signal function. This is one of the first cases where economists were asked to value the environmental damage costs of one of the largest oil spills at that time in 1989 by Exxon Valdez in front of the coast of Alaska. We actually had a water talk from Kevin Boyle from Virginia Tech yesterday, talking very specifically about this one and the oil spill of BP in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. So typically what you see is that these oil companies then clean up the mess that spill creates, and they're willing to pay the communities living along the coast for their lost use values, fisheries, for example, shellfish, etc., an amount of money in the order of magnitude 4 million. But then based on economic valuation methods of the wider public goods and services involved that were considered damaged by the oil spill, not just now, but decades into the future, was valued at 3 billion. And then in the end, Exxon settled in court and was urged to pay 1.1 billion to compensate for the environmental damage costs that they caused. And this is an example where the economic valuation took place afterwards. There is only one piece of legislation that I'm aware of in another state in the US, Hawaii, where even before a catastrophic spill takes place, oil companies, transportation companies are warned that if you damage our coral reefs, you're going to pay $10,000 per square meter of damage that you cause. And so that really induces behavioral change. It was the Exxon Valdez, but it's also legislation like this that makes oil companies to reconsider the transportation routes of the oil. It makes them include double hulls in their ships. So there was a single hull in 1989 when we had the Exxon Valdez spill. Nowadays, that's not common practice anymore. Common practice is double hull. By making them pay for the environmental damage, they change their behavior. This is another example. Mangrove ecosystems provide free services, and here you can see a whole bunch of them. They provide a nursery, fishery habitat. Local communities get fuel wood out of them, but they also trap sediments. They sequestrate carbon, and very importantly, they protect us from storms. They buffer the storm water. They buffer us against tornadoes, etc. And what you saw in the 1980s, 1990s, that a lot of these mangroves were lost, especially in Central and South America. It was converted into land for housing, shrimp farming, crops. And this is a satellite picture from Honduras, 1987, and then 12 years later, a lot of the land was converted. A lot of the mangroves that were found in that place were converted into agricultural land. And then if you do an economic analysis where you compare the conservation of mangroves with shrimp farming, and you look at what the values are that you get out of the mangroves and that you can sell on a market, so just look at the private goods and services that you get out and that you can trade on a market, like timber and non-timber products, the value is around $90 per hectare. If you then look at the value, the net value of the shrimp farmers of 2,000, then any economist will tell you it's so much more beneficial to go for shrimp farming than to keep the mangroves there for timber and non-timber products. So the decision is then based on an economic analysis that only includes those goods and services that we can easily sell and trade on a market. If we then start factoring in broader ecosystem services like the fishery nursery and most importantly the coastal protection that is provided by these mangroves in these coastal areas, the subsidies that shrimp farmers are given are subtracted from their profits, and we even account for the pollution costs, then the picture looks very, very differently. And the decision is actually going to be overturned if you include these broader goods and services in your economic analysis. So pricing these public goods and services may change behavior and may overturn decisions. So that's the third reason, change behavior. And what we have in economics is the so-called price elasticity of demand. So it refers to the extent to which we actually change our behavior if we impose or increase a price. And there's a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion about water pricing, and a lot of people are against water pricing. The reason being that they think that it is very inelastic. Inelastic means that there is not a lot of movement. You increase the price and the consumption of water hardly moves, so it's inelastic. Elastic means that you increase the price a little bit and you see a large move in the use or change in the use and consumption of water. And typically residential indoor water demand is considered to be very inelastic. Similarly, the industrial water use is not proportional to the increase in the price. So it not proportionally means in this case that if you change the price, it doesn't change equally with the price change. So completely inelastic is 0, completely elastic is minus 1.0. So you increase the price by 1% and consumption goes down by 1%. If it's not proportionate, the value of the elasticity is less than minus 1. Yeah, so you increase the price by 1% and the decrease in water consumption is less than 1%. So that is called inelastic. And there are some uses here, like recreational water use, that are typically considered luxury goods. You change the price, and then you see that demand changes quite radically. And I worked in this on these price elasticities some years ago already, and this is giving an overview of the available empirical evidence in that particular areas. There is very limited empirical evidence about how people react to water pricing, and this was a summary that I made with one of my previous supervisors, David Pierce, from London College. And one very important sector is missing here. Any clue? What's the largest water user in the world? Yeah. So we could hardly find any evidence on price elasticities of agriculture, and agriculture is a very powerful sector. If you go down south in Europe and you start talking about water pricing, you're really in trouble. They don't really want to talk about that. They think they already pay a lot for water because of the electricity costs of pumping the water up from the groundwater wells, and that is what we typically pay for. It's the supply and the delivery of the water that John was referring to in the beginning into our house, but we don't actually pay for the resource itself. And that's why we have the moratorium, I think, to some extent here in Ontario as well, where there's a moratorium on groundwater pumping by companies like Nestle. And they gain a lot of resource rents from the resource, but the scarcer the resource gets, the more valuable that resource becomes, and it's not reflected in the prices that we pay. So I did some work on that, and so typically what you hear, including from policymakers, is that water pricing is inelastic. And if you look at residential water demand and industrial water demand, that was exactly what you saw in the previous picture. And so I investigated to what extent there was any empirical evidence available related to agriculture. I managed to find just under 40 studies worldwide over a larger time period, almost 400 observations in different places, including here in Canada, but especially in South Europe, North Africa. And there was a significant negative correlation between the price that farmers currently already pay and the size of the elasticity. And it makes a lot of sense. You don't maybe even have to be an economist to understand that if you already pay a lot for a good or a service and you increase that good or service, that the reaction is higher. And that is basically that what this curve is indicating. The less you pay, the lower the reaction if you start increasing the price. And so the argument that farmers do not react to increases in water prices makes a lot of sense, because they hardly pay for water. So you start increasing a little bit the price of water in agriculture and the reaction is minimum. But that is because the share of water, the costs of the resource water in their total production cost is very limited. If they pay a lot already, they will reduce their water use much more than when they pay very little. And that was an important outcome of this study, where I basically found that users do react, maybe not proportionate, but that doesn't matter. They do react, and that's the key message here. Maybe not a reduction of 1% if you increase the price by 1%, but they do react, and you can save water by increasing the water price. And more importantly, by increasing the water price, you make farmers think about alternative technologies that they could use in their farming practices to save water. And that is what we want. So you can change behavior by pricing. And the way we measure the effectiveness of the pricing instrument is through the elasticity that I just showed you. To what extent that applies to all water services is something that obviously has to be considered very carefully. There are countries in the world where you hardly pay for drinking water. So Ireland is a very good case here. For centuries, the Irish have never paid for drinking water. It's an illusion to think that that is the case, actually, because there is someone who picks up the bill. They don't maybe necessarily pay it right away through their drinking water price, because there is no drinking water price. But as a public taxpayer, they obviously pay for the supply of the drinking water. But there was not a drinking water price because the government of Ireland considered drinking water supply a public good, a public right. Everyone has a right to clean drinking water coming out of their tap. Then in 2008, the shit hit the fan and the crisis started, and they started monitoring their water use in houses, and they introduced the water price, and there was a huge public protest in Ireland. But it has become public practice, common practice now in countries like Ireland as well. So it may take a while, and it may not go very easily and smoothly, but after a while you may be able to convince people that metering and charging people for the use of water is a sensible thing to do. If you don't pay that way, you pay it in another way through your income taxes. But if you want to be economically efficient, we strongly believe that you have to tax the actual use. And it's also considered very fair, I would say. It's fair to make sure that everyone has a right to clean drinking water, but it's maybe also equally fair that larger users pay more than smaller users. Okay, so I'm talking about markets as a possible way to coordinate resources and their allocation, and it's obviously not the only way of allocating these resources, but that's what I'm particularly interested in. And in the case of these public environmental goods and services, it's the ecosystem, it's the environment that provides these services free of charge. And there is a demand by society. We value these services. They are valuable. We cannot live without clean drinking water. We cannot live without clean air. And that automatically then creates some of the prime conditions that need to be in place to put a market in place. And what I'm particularly interested in is what are the legal, institutional, and financial terms and conditions under which you create such a market, and what is the price that then comes out. So payments for watershed services is something that has come up especially after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, and ecosystem services became very popular and a priority theme on the political agenda. And it's a little bit illustrated here, where if you do not collaborate upstream and downstream, then the picture looks really bad. And there are benefits of collaborating between upstream land users, often forest owners, for example, and downstream water users. And so the issue here is, how do you then create a market, or how do you facilitate the transfer of money from the downstream users who want clean and enough water for their economic activities to the upstream landowners? So typically what you see is upstream, they pollute, and then you have the negative impacts downstream, or you cut a forest upstream and there are sediments flowing into the river. And a lot of hydropower plants are suffering from that. They have to dredge their reservoirs to make sure that they maintain the lifetime of their basins, because otherwise it just fills up with sediments. And it's often so much cheaper for them to pay upstream land users or landowners than to dredge every year the sediment out of their reservoirs. And that's the principle, and those are the preconditions that you often find where these kind of markets are being created. So what a decision maker needs to know, first of all, is any economic analysis in this particular field depends on a sound scientific underpinning. You need to know what the causal relationship is between the use of the land or the water upstream and the water quality and the water provision downstream. So it starts with a hydrological assessment. And then obviously there has to be a willingness to pay of downstream users to compensate the upstream land owners for good behavior. And equally, the upstream landowners have to be willing to accept financial compensation to change their behavior. It's the same as when you buy a house. You have someone who's willing to pay an amount of money for a house, and you have a seller who's willing to accept a certain amount of money for your house, and you negotiate, you trade, and ultimately you get a price. It's exactly the same principle. You have a willingness to pay, and you have a willingness to accept. And then you create a market in which the buyers and the sellers come together, and you trade, you negotiate, and a price results. Last but definitely not least important is how you organize this. What is the institutional structure and arrangement that you put in place? And as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm particularly interested in this because you have all kinds of costs associated with implementing these kind of schemes, and I'm interested in doing that in the least cost way possible. So I looked globally at these different types of schemes that are around. There is some literature on it where they look at the success factors of these schemes, and typically they're very qualitative in nature. What is very important when you talk about these schemes is conditionality and additionality. Conditionality is that you really want to make sure that if you pay for something, you get what you're paying for. Yeah, so that the condition is that you pay for a particular service. It also has to be additional, and that is something that came up a couple of years later, meaning that you throw money at farmers or landowners, and you want to make sure that what you give them actually induces a behavioral change. If it doesn't actually change the behavior, it's not going to be very effective. So there has to be an incremental effect of giving farmers money. And it's a very big issue in Europe, where farmers are subsidized for decades already for taking nature protection measures on their land. And everyone gets exactly the same amount of money. And it's not necessary. There are some farmers who are more inclined to do it and require less financial compensation than others. And there is not enough research going on, in my view, where we identify how we can more specifically target the amount of money that we need to give to farmers. So some of the work that I've done is looking at contract flexibility, so contract design theory, contracts that these farmers have to conclude with the government, and if you give them more freedom of choice in these contracts, their demand for financial compensation goes down. If they have, if they are more environmentally inclined, they are driven by environmental motivations to take nature conservation measures on their land, their demand for financial compensation goes down. And it is not always the solution to just throw money to farmers or to landowners to make them change their behaviors. There are other ways of doing that as well. And that is in particular of interest here to me, because we have limited resources in the government. It's our money, it's our public taxpayers' money, and we want to use that money in the best possible way. So the factors that contribute to the functioning of these pest schemes are generally fairly poorly understood, and there is some literature on it, but we're not very certain yet how these designs should ideally look like. This is an article in Science in 2015 by Naeem et al., where they look at these schemes and they say, make sure that you get the science right, because a lot of these schemes lack a good scientific underpinning of the causal relationships upstream and downstream. And what I'm particularly interested in is get the economics right, get the institutional economics right when you do these kind of schemes. This is a slide which shows you the importance of additionality. So you have an amount of land that has forest on it, and on the vertical axis we have a payment. And this is the profit function for the landowner. And there is a part of the land that the owner will never clear because it's simply not economically profitable. And so you can throw money at that landowner, but that landowner, even without the payment, would never have cleared the land of the forest in this particular trajectory. The moment you get positive profit, reflected in this very simple linear line, that's where the effect of the payment starts kicking in. Only at that point where the payment is higher than the profit will the landowner start changing his or her behavior and stop cutting the land, because the payment is higher than the profit that they get out of converting the land into agricultural land, for example. And then at some point the price is not high enough anymore and the profit exceeds the payment, and so they will clear the land. So it's very important. This is a very simple graph, but it's very important to understand at what point the payment is actually going to be effective. And it means that you have to have insight in the operational efficiency of these individual landowners. So you need to know what it costs and what the benefits are of practicing farming on land that is currently forested to avoid the deforestation. And this is an example from Costa Rica, where a lot of these schemes were introduced in the early 1990s. But Costa Rica had a very long history already of ecotourism, for example. You go to one of their wonderful national parks and you pay an entrance fee everywhere. And farmers have already been induced to curb and to reverse the deforestation rates in the 1970s. So they had all kinds of tax discounts, etc., that helped them to preserve the forest on their land or to reforest the land that they owned. And then in the mid or end 1990s, this payment for ecosystem services was introduced. So they had this history already of reversing the trend of deforestation, and then the marginal or the incremental impact of paying them a little bit extra was hardly noticeable. So they were already at a point where they were not deforesting already, because ecotourism would give them so much more money than converting the land into agricultural land. So back to the issue, what exactly are the factors that define the functioning of these pest schemes? There's been some literature on the fact that these pest schemes often have multiple objectives. They don't just want to conserve nature, they also want to alleviate poverty. So a lot of these schemes are found in developing countries where they have multiple objectives at the same time. There's a distinction between user and government-financed schemes, and these user-financed schemes have been found to be more effective than government-financed schemes. User-finance being, for example, a hydropower plant downstream compensating landowners upstream. And then there are some other arguments, the clarity of the ecosystem service. You need to have clear and enforceable rules and mechanisms to make sure that it actually happens. The costs and benefits have to be visible and quantifiable, etc. So what I did was this global review of the institutional economic design characteristics of these different schemes. It was work that was done in 2011. It was published in Conservation Biology. It's basically a meta-analysis, a quantitative meta-analysis. So the difference with what was done in the past is that I actually tried to quantify the factors and the delivery of the ecosystem services. I used the Watershed Markets website, where there are different examples of schemes worldwide where water services are being traded. We used additional secondary data sources, and we sent out a questionnaire to 52 payments for watershed services schemes in different places. We had a response rate of 38%. We looked at institutional arrangements where typically water and land managers were paid for the provision of these water services. The schemes generally aimed at watershed protection, and you have to think about drinking water supply, irrigation, reduction of sediment loads, etc. A distinction was made between voluntary and mandatory schemes. So typically economic markets work on a voluntary basis, but there are also some mandatory schemes. One of the largest in China, for example, the sloping land scheme. There is not a lot of choice for farmers to participate or not. This is a conceptualization, so you have someone who provides the ecosystem service, you have someone who's interested in buying it, and then you have an economic transaction, and then as a result you get a change in the hydroecological status of your water. And what I'm interested in is the context under which the watershed market is being created. So the legal, institutional, economic context. How much money do you pay the farmers or the landowners? How often are they getting paid? What are the length of the contracts? What happens if they don't comply with the terms and conditions? Are there enforcement rules in place, etc.? This is the model. So I looked very specifically at the characteristics of the schemes, the characteristics of the players on the market, the terms and conditions of participation in the market, the payment characteristics, and the compliance characteristics. So if you comply or if you don't comply, are there any enforcement rules and mechanisms in place? I was very ambitious in the beginning, and my response variable was the provision of these ecosystem services, these watershed services. So I aim to assess and estimate the cubic meters of water that were being provided by each of these schemes. and the amount that was being provided, to what extent was that a function of the price that was being paid, the characteristics of the scheme that was put in place, the types of players that were playing that were negotiating in the market, and that information was hardly available in the 50+ schemes that I looked at. So what I had to do in the end was simply look at the extent to which the environmental objective of the scheme was being achieved, yes or no. And I did that on the basis of scientific literature and based on the questionnaire that we sent out. There was a database describing the schemes and all their characteristics. This is an overview of the size of the distribution of the sizes of the schemes. So, for example, this huge scheme in China, sloping land, is here, more than 1,000 hectares. There's a huge one in South Africa. So overall, we ended up investigating or getting quantitative data for 47 schemes in total that covered 22 million hectares of land. And if I remember correctly, these schemes received over $500 million every year for compensating landowners, in particular upstream landowners, for taking nature conservation measures on their land so that water quality would not be impaired downstream. Most schemes in Central America, I mentioned already, Costa Rica has a long history. On average, they were 10, 11 years old. Most of the services that were provided were drinking water supply, so you had downstream water users as a substantial share of the buyers of the services. In most cases, the schemes were voluntarily. They involved private forest owners and farmers, and sometimes they operated as a community. So sometimes there were contracts that were concluded with an entire village instead of with an individual water landowner. A little bit more, a third approximately was implemented at national scale. 2/3 of the schemes had quantitative objectives. But these quantitative measurements were largely lacking, and that's why I had to use a very simplistic response variable. So in total, 47%, so less than half of the schemes had monitored quantitative objectives. And then in those cases where they had quantified objectives, the objective was not so much the actual provision of the water service, but it was how much land was set aside to ensure that the watershed service was provided. So the causal relationship that I referred to in the beginning was lacking in a majority of these schemes. All that these schemes were measuring was how much land is set aside or is being protected so that the watershed services are being provided. So that's a measurement of the effort. It's not a measurement of the outcome that we are ultimately interested in. So remember that I talked about conditionality. Conditionality means that you actually contractually provide what you're being paid for. What these upstream landowners and farmers were being paid for was set aside. They were not necessarily paid for the outcome. And in the end, 58%, so just over half of the schemes were reaching their environmental objectives. So they met the conditionality criterion, but it was only in 60% of the cases. This is the self-reported effectiveness of the scheme. So these are the scheme managers who were asked, how effective are you in actually achieving the objectives? And remarkably, 1/3 of them had no clue. This is the results. Ignore the numbers; they're not important. The only thing what I want to show you in this overview is that some of the prior expectations were not found to be statistically significant. So how mature a scheme was didn't actually affect the conservation, the protection, the level of protection of the watershed. And implementing these schemes at national level also didn't have any significant effect on the effectiveness of the schemes. What we did find was that one of the best functioning schemes was where hydropower companies were compensating directly upstream landowners. And it made a lot of sense because I already started off talking about this in the beginning. They know exactly how much they pay every year to dredge and to get the sediments out of their reservoirs, because these reservoirs have a certain lifetime, and the lifetime is seriously affected by sedimentation loads coming from upstream. And they know what the dredging costs are, and they can pay less than the costs of dredging to upstream landowners to reduce the loads in their reservoirs. So those schemes were particularly effective in providing the ecosystem services. Maybe also not unexpected, the more people that were in between the buyer and the seller, the number of intermediaries, had a significant negative impact. So there's an increase in so-called transaction costs. If you establish a market and you have a lot of intermediary people that are also all trying to get something out of that market, that reduces the effectiveness of the market in actually providing the ecosystem service. Voluntary participation had a significant negative impact. So what the analysis showed, that if you impose and participation is not voluntary, then it's going to be much more effective in actually reaching your environmental objective. If the contract is with the entire community, that has a significant positive impact, and that is maybe a little bit as expected as well, because there's a lot of control by the community in actually providing the service. There are schemes where people are paid in kind, and that didn't really seem to work. People really prefer cash. And if there is monitoring going on of quantified environmental objectives, so people actually monitor progress, that has a significant positive effect on the delivery of the ecosystem services as well. This last one puzzled me a little bit. So it's highly significant, but it has a significant negative sign. So it's the criteria that are being used to select the people who can participate in the market. And I always thought that if you can be picky, you can pick the best in participating in your scheme, who can provide the largest share of ecosystem services. But that didn't show up in our results. And a very important reason is that the schemes, in a majority of the cases, had multiple objectives. It was environmental protection and poverty alleviation. And there's a trade-off between the two. So if you include, for example, one of the criteria was that you need to include landless, marginalized farmers. Their contribution in actually protecting the watershed and providing these watershed services is really minimum. But a lot of these schemes have that as an explicit objective. So they are participating, and so you may raise their income, their household income, which is considered a very important side objective, but it reduces the effectiveness of the scheme. Does anyone see something in the nature of the factors that doesn't make sense? Or so I talked you through the general scheme characteristics. I talked about the characteristics of the players involved, the nature of the scheme participation, the payment characteristics, the scheme compliance and enforcement. Is anything missing here? So at the beginning I was talking about water pricing. Where is the price? There is no price. And the reason that there is no price is because it had no effect. It didn't matter how much you were paying them, to what extent you were delivering what you were expected to deliver. So the price itself, the most important instrument for economics and in the creation of the market, did not show up as a significant factor in driving the results from these schemes. And economically, that doesn't make any sense at all. Right? Because you want to have a price and you want to change behavior, but it didn't show up significant in this analysis, which is very worrying. Just like the fact that we have so many millions hectares of land, and as I mentioned, like $500 million are being invested in these schemes on an annual basis, and less than 50% of these schemes are monitoring quantitatively what comes out of these schemes. And as an economist, that hurts. It really hurts, because you can use that money maybe in a much more effective manner in other ways. There are huge opportunity costs involved. So it's a very popular instrument, economic instrument that a lot of governments in developing countries like to use, but the effectiveness is very questionable. Yeah. So we find a number of things, indicators referring to efforts instead of the outcomes. That's another thing. So the issue of conditionality. Hardly any of these schemes meet the criterion of conditionality. Incrementality or additionality we were unable to prove. If you don't monitor, you have no idea what the causal relationship is between what happens upstream and what you get then downstream. Scheme participation conditions were found to have a significant effect, as expected, where especially community contracts came out as particularly beneficial. But there are a lot of selection criteria that are being used in these schemes, and they affect the effectiveness of these payment schemes. There are some caveats, of course, underlying the analysis. As you could see, there were only 47 observations. The R-square was less than 50%. In a lot of cases, I was unable to get quantified data for all the relevant influencing factors. But it was one of the first studies that was carried out where we tried to quantitatively assess what are the drivers and what are the success factors in providing these watershed services. The most important conclusion or recommendation that I think came out of this study is that we need international monitoring guidelines for how effective these schemes really are and what they are aiming to achieve. So here are some references of work that I did afterwards, looking at these water markets, not only for wildlife and nature conservation, but also to deal with climate change. And as I mentioned, I did some work on incentivizing afforestation agreements, for example, with these contracts. And what I found is that if you introduce contract flexibility, you look at the motivational drivers of landowners to participate in these schemes, there is no need for these uniform payments that you typically see in a lot of the European member states, for example. And so there you can save a lot of money by using targeted and varied compensation levels to the land owners. And that's basically what I wanted to share with you. This is my journal, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Roy, for a very inspiring and informative talk. And I do want to assure you that having heard your presentation, I commit to henceforth paying my water bills with more enthusiasm than perhaps was the case previously. So this presentation is now open for questions, but we do have a bit of a logistical problem, and that is that we have only one microphone, and both the questioner and the answer have to be recorded because this is being webcast, have to be recorded on the microphone. So Larissa, wherever she is going to have the tough act of moving the microphone from the questioner back to Roy so that he can answer into the microphone. So questions, ladies and gentlemen, for our speaker today.
So it's fairly easy to see the connection of a downstream, hydroelectric dam and upstream people reducing their sediment. In a place like Canada, where an awful lot of public resources are on Crown land, not owned by anybody, and the money really just has to go back to the public coffers. What's the impact of how the money is used, or the perception of the public as to how escalating taxes for use of these kinds of resources and ends up benefiting them?
So it depends very much on which part or which share of the public you're paying, you're talking about. So I think it's fairly easy to convince users, visitors, for example. I did a study in Long Point where you have Crown Land, for example, to pay an entrance fee. Because they're visiting and they're interested in visiting. And in those cases where you aim to have conservation in combination with limited use of the area, entrance fees, for example, work fairly well. If you start closing off areas, and it becomes more and more difficult to identify who exactly is benefiting from it. Typically, tax money is used for those kind of conservation efforts. In the case of these schemes, you really have to be able to identify who is benefiting from it. Otherwise, it won't really work. You cannot create a market. You cannot convince people to pay for something if it's unclear what exactly they're paying for.
Thanks, Roy. It was an interesting methodology. Two questions with regards to the quantification of environmental services for your example on mangroves. One is, how did you quantify the rate for coastal protection? Was that based on what the structural alternatives would be in addition, instead of the natural protection? And secondly, how do you quantify the aesthetic variables or the recreational variables, let's say, of a wetland ecosystem?
Yeah, so you're right. There are two ways of actually doing it, and there was a very nice study related to a horrible event after Katrina, where an economist showed that the damage costs of Katrina could have been half if the mangroves along the Gulf of Mexico had not been cut off. That's the alternative way of measuring the value of coastal protection. So you can look at the infrastructure costs. So what would you have to put in place if those mangroves would not be in place? An alternative is to look at the avoided damage costs. And a second. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so in terms of recreation, what we typically look at is travel costs. So people apparently are willing to incur costs to travel to certain areas, like take Long Point, and we take those travel costs as an indicator for the value that people attach to visit a particular area.
Two quick questions. One is, how would you apply these wonderful ideas to the groundwater in our area? And part B, how would you apply some of it to the Great Lakes?
I just came from a meeting next door, Global Water Futures and Lakes Futures, which is talking about the Great Lakes. I think one of the most important first steps is to identify, as I also mentioned to the previous question, who is benefiting exactly, and which services are you impairing if you have nutrient loadings in the Great Lakes. And to what extent you can then start thinking about putting a market system in place, for example, on phosphorus trading, depends very much on the incentives that you put in place for the farmers to actually reduce the use of phosphorus. So you need to find a way to internalize, as economists say, the externalities, the social costs of eutrophication in the Great Lakes, for example, into their daily practices. And that is very, very difficult, because it's very difficult to link diffuse sources of pollution, like nutrients running off agricultural land, to individual farmers, and to make the link between the eutrophication in the Great Lakes all the way back up to the Grand River watershed, for example, the Upper Nith or whatever watershed within the Grand River watershed, and identify this farmer contributes to this extent to the eutrophication problem. But there are opportunities, even if you don't know exactly what these environmental damage costs may look like, you can think about how much you would have to either subsidize or punish or tax, in this case, the farmer to induce her or him to reduce the loading in the on their land.
Okay, I think we should probably stop the questions, except I have to ask one, if I may. So as I listen to you, Roy, I can't help but become a bit concerned about the fact that we have two trains coming down the track. And I'm not sure whether they're on parallel tracks or whether they're on the same track and headed for collision. And the trains are these. On the one hand, you have agriculture, which puts enormous demand on our water resources, the availability of our water resources. And on the other hand, you have food, which is part of agriculture. So what we have is limited availability of water on one track, and frankly, limited availability of food on the other track. Because if you look at the predictions, it's not too far down the road when we're not going to be able to feed all the people who are projected to be on this planet. So I would be interested in your speculation on whether these two trains are headed for collision or whether there's something we can do to keep them on parallel tracks.
It's a very difficult discussion. In Europe, I worked a lot with farmers as well, and you have to be very transparent, and you have to be very clear with farmers what you're expecting them to do. Like in Europe, after the Second World War, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, everything was on food security. So it's sometimes also not bad to look back a little bit at what happened in the past and how we came to where we currently are. Farmers have been incentivized through subsidies, etc., to produce as much food as possible because food security was our major objective. Then our bellies were filled, and we started to look around and thought, it's very nice to have a clean environment as well. And a lot of the responsibility of what is happening with our water resources, with our natural environment, even air, is being put on the plate of farmers, and you can question sometimes whether that's a really fair thing to do. In order to solve this, you have to have a clear conversation with the farmers about what you're expecting them to do, and it's not just a government with a farmer or farming organization. Us as consumers have to be part of that conversation as well. Ultimately, what we want is cheap food on our table every night, which is affordable. Just like you hate paying the water bill, maybe we also want affordable food, and that comes at a price. And farmers for decades have been very functional and very successful in providing that. Now that we start figuring out that this production system comes with all kinds of social costs, we have to find other ways of internalizing what Vasily was referring to in his question. How do you deal with the eutrophication problems that are now occurring in the Great Lakes, and how do you induce farmers to use new technologies or better technologies, and what role can economics then play in providing the right monetary incentives to also make sure that they make that investment. But it is clearly, in my view, related to the consumer. If we are not willing to pay extra for organic food or sustainably farmed food, these farmers will be forced to do it in the least cost way, and the least cost way is not always the most environmentally sustainable or friendly way. If you want to do it in another way, that comes at a cost, and someone has to pick up the bill, and it cannot only be the agricultural sector paying for that.
Spoken by a true economist. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me once again in thanking Roy for a really interesting and informative presentation.